In this video, you are going to just summarize the things that you have learned so far in geometry that will help you with writing proofs. The first are the 5 properties of equality, which include addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So those 4 are just telling you, hey, if you add 2 to one side of the equation, you can add 2 to the other side. So these are just what keep equations balanced. The 5th property of equality was the substitution, which just allows you to replace something with something else. And in this property, you might be replacing like x with 2, or you might be replacing a segment with a different segment if you know that they're congruent. So you're really just replacing one thing with another. We've seen the distributive property before, so just as a quick example, that would be something like 7 times x plus 3. Well, you can go ahead and distribute that 7 and get yourself to 7x plus 21. The reflexive property was a property where nothing changes. So if you have 2 things that are exactly the same, that's the reflexive property. And in our notes earlier in this chapter, we talked about A equals A as an example of that. So it's just when nothing changes. The symmetric property is sometimes, you're going to hear me say flip-flop property. What that looks like is if you have some A equal to B, then you can flip-flop those and say B is equal to A. So that is what the symmetric property looks like. And last but not least, the transitive. That was where we said cut out the middleman. And I'll show you what I mean by that in just a second here. So you can see if you have A equal to B and B equal to C, well, you can cut out that middle one because both of those share B. And you can just say that A equals C. So then A is equal to C. So those are the properties, and those might show up in this section 2.6, and they might also show up in section 2.7 when we start getting into proofwriting. All right, we've got 10 definitions that most of these actually come back from chapter 1. And one thing with these, just to note here, these can be read from left to right or right to left. Can be read from left to right or right to left. All right, so when you're using these in a proof, these definitions might go one way or the other, but you're still using that definition. So congruent segments. Say we know that our segment AB is congruent to segment CD. So if those are congruent segments, well then their lengths are equal. So what you could say then is that the length of AB is equal to the length of CD. And you can do that same thing for angles. So if you know angle 1, for example, is congruent to some angle 2, well, then you can say that their measures are the same. So say that the measure of angle 1 is 15, well then that would mean that the measure of angle 2 is also 15 if those are congruent angles. For midpoint, let's draw ourselves a little picture here. So here I have segment AB, and we're going to put M right in the middle as the midpoint, which would tell us that this segment is congruent to this segment. So what we can conclude there is that AM, that segment, is congruent to segment MB. So that's what the midpoint definition tells us. Angle bisector is very similar to that. So the angle bisector just cuts angle into 2 congruent angles, or it makes two congruent angles. All right, we've talked about complementary and supplementary back in chapter 1. If you remember, complementary is 90 degrees. So you'd have two angles that measures add up to 90 degrees. And on the other hand, supplementary was 180 degrees. So you might have two angles that add up to 180. All right. Perpendicular, if you remember, those just form right angles. And what is a right angle? Well, a right angle is any angle who has a measure of 90 degrees. Linear pair is very similar to supplementary. So those are two angles, always two angles that are supplementary. And lastly, we learned this back in chapter 1 as well. Vertical angles are congruent. So let's just write that. Vertical angles are always congruent. All right, so those 10 definitions can help you out with a lot of things. Now what I mean is can be read from left to right or right to left. That would be like for this one, you could start with segment AB is congruent to segment CD, or you could start with this and go either from here to here or from right to left. So that's still using the definition of congruent segments either way. All right, and the last thing you're going to see in this short little video here is the postulates that we learned in chapter 1. We're going to draw a little picture for each of these. So for segment addition, draw a segment, put a point somewhere in between those two. And let's say this is A, B, C. Well, segment addition just lets you do this. It tells you that AB plus BC is equal to AC. So for example, if you knew AB was 2 and BC was 5, well, we know that the length of AC then would be 7 altogether. So that works with numbers. It also works with letters. So both examples are there for you. And lastly, angle addition. So say that we have this angle. I'm going to give it just a generic name. We'll call it angle XYZ. And then somewhere in the middle, we have this point W. Well, angle addition tells you that the measure of angle XYW, that would be this angle here, plus the measure of angle WYZ, this smaller angle here, is equal to the measure of the entire angle, which is angle XYZ. All right, and last but not least, a linear pair. If you remember, a linear pair makes a line. So draw yourself a line, split it up, and if we would call this angle 1 and angle 2, this is actually the same as the definition of linear pair. Angle 1 and angle 2 are supplementary. So that is one of our postulates back from chapter 1. Now, one thing that I just want to mention before we finish here is that a linear pair's postulate is the same thing as a linear pair's definition. So those are interchangeable. The rest, there is one definition or one postulate that you can use when we're doing our proof writing. So use this toolbox. We're going to get to the last part, theorems, when we get into section 2.7. So just hold off on these. We will finish these in lesson 2.7. Okay, so that will help you out. You can use this on your test, so make sure you get that filled in. And if you have any questions, please let me know.